Carl Jung once suggested that becoming who you truly are is not a comfortable process, but what he understood, and what most people only discover the hard way, is that individuation does not just transform you, it reorganizes your entire relational world in ways you never consciously agreed to. Healing is sold as liberation, as clarity, as becoming stronger. But nobody explains that when you stop betraying yourself in subtle, socially acceptable ways, certain people begin to feel the absence of that betrayal long before you do. At first, it feels almost invisible. You simply start noticing your own reactions more clearly. You notice how often you apologize for things that are not wrong. You notice how often you explain yourself in order to soften other people's discomfort. You notice how frequently you override your own intuition just to maintain harmony. And instead of judging yourself for it, you begin, slowly, almost cautiously, to interrupt it. You pause before saying yes. You sit with the discomfort of not filling silence. You allow someone else to carry their own emotional weight without stepping in to regulate it. And nothing explodes. No dramatic confrontation happens. No obvious betrayal occurs. But something changes. Because the moment you stop unconsciously stabilizing a dynamic, that dynamic has to stabilize itself. And many relationships were never built to do that. This is the part no one prepares you for. You expected healing to make your life bigger. Instead, it begins by making it quieter. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly now feel slightly strained. People who once leaned on you emotionally begin reacting differently when you do not immediately respond in the old way. There is a subtle tension that enters the space, not loud enough to name, but strong enough to feel. And because you are becoming more conscious, you feel it more intensely than before. You begin to sense the invisible contracts that were holding certain connections together. The unspoken expectation that you would always be understanding, that you would always stretch just a little further, that you would always absorb the ambiguity, the inconsistency, the emotional immaturity, because you were strong enough to handle it. But strength built on self-abandonment is not stability. It is endurance. And endurance has limits. When you start healing, you do not become colder. You become less available for unconscious roles. You stop being the emotional shock absorber. You stop translating your boundaries into something easier to swallow. You stop shrinking your disappointment so that others do not feel exposed. And this withdrawal, this quiet reclaiming of energy, does something profound. It reveals which relationships were reciprocal and which were sustained by your overfunctioning. That realization can be destabilizing because you did not think you were overfunctioning. You thought you were loving. You thought you were mature. You thought you were the bigger person. But the more conscious you become, the more you recognize how often being the bigger person meant tolerating things that quietly eroded your sense of self. And when you stop tolerating them, not aggressively, not dramatically, but simply by not participating anymore, the system shifts. Some people feel confused. Some feel threatened. Some begin to subtly pull away. Not because you attacked them, but because the version of you that made the dynamic easy has dissolved. And here is the psychological paradox that makes this so painful. You are becoming more authentic. But your world may temporarily become smaller. Not because you are unlovable, not because you are difficult, but because authenticity removes access to the parts of you that were once negotiable. And the people who were attached to those negotiable parts may not know how to relate to you now. This is why healing can feel like loss. Not dramatic loss, not catastrophic loss, but relational thinning. A subtle reduction in noise, a subtle increase in space. And space, especially when you are used to being needed, can feel like abandonment, even when it is actually alignment. What makes this stage of healing so disorienting is not only the shift in other people, it is the shift in your own nervous system. Because even when change is healthy, even when it moves you toward integrity, your body does not automatically interpret it as safe. For years, perhaps since childhood, your sense of belonging may have been tied to attunement, to sensing the emotional temperature of a room before anyone else did, to adjusting your tone, your reactions, your expectations in order to maintain connection. And that pattern did not form because you were weak. It formed because at some point it was intelligent. It kept you close to people. It reduced conflict. It preserved attachment. So when you begin to interrupt that pattern, when you allow someone to misunderstand you without rushing to clarify, when you allow disappointment to remain visible instead of disguising it as indifference, when you stop volunteering to be the stable one every single time, your nervous system does not immediately celebrate your growth. It registers uncertainty. It senses distance. It anticipates rejection. And this is where many people retreat. Because the loneliness that follows growth can feel almost unbearable, especially if your identity was built around being needed, being reliable, being the one who holds everything together. When the messages slow down, when invitations feel different, when someone subtly accuses you of changing, your first instinct may be to repair, to soften, to reassure, to go back just slightly, not fully into self-abandonment, but enough to restore the familiar rhythm. But that urge is not always compassion. Sometimes it is fear of disconnection. Sometimes it is the old survival code, whispering that belonging requires effort, that closeness must be maintained through adjustment, that love is something you earn through emotional labor. And healing dismantles that code, not loudly, not heroically, but through repeated micro-choices. The choice not to over-explain. The choice not to absorb tension. The choice to let someone sit with their own discomfort. The choice to tolerate being perceived as distant rather than collapsing your boundary to regain approval. These micro-choices accumulate, and over time, they create a version of you that feels internally steadier but externally less predictable. And unpredictability disrupts established dynamics. If someone unconsciously relied on your constant availability, your new rhythm feels like withdrawal. If someone relied on your emotional regulation, your neutrality feels like coldness. If someone relied on your tolerance of ambiguity, your clarity feels like confrontation. Not because you became harsh, but because you became defined. Defined people are harder to lean on without consent. Defined people do not automatically carry what is handed to them. Defined people have edges, and edges reveal where enmeshment once existed. This is why healing can create temporary isolation, because you are no longer relating from unconscious fusion. You are relating from differentiation. And differentiation feels like separation before it feels like stability. There may be nights where you question yourself, moments where you wonder whether you overcorrected, whether you misinterpreted something, whether becoming stronger made you less lovable. But what you are actually experiencing is recalibration. Your system is learning that connection does not require constant self-editing. Your identity is reorganizing around authenticity instead of approval. And that reorganization is rarely smooth. It is quiet. It is subtle. It is sometimes painfully lonely. But it is not regression. It is restructuring. There is another layer to this that is even more uncomfortable. Sometimes you do not only miss the people, you miss who you were with them. You miss the version of yourself that felt necessary. Because being needed can feel intoxicating. Being the stable one can feel powerful. Being the one others rely on can give your identity structure. And when you step out of that role, there is a withdrawal, not from them, but from the familiarity of who you used to be. The old dynamic may not have been healthy, but it was predictable. You knew how to function inside it. You knew how to anticipate reactions. You knew how to fix tension before it escalated. You knew how to regain closeness if it started to slip. Now, you do not. Now, you are choosing not to manage what is not yours. And that lack of control can feel terrifying. Because control often masquerades as connection. You may find yourself romanticizing the past, remembering the closeness, the intensity, the long conversations, forgetting how exhausted you felt afterward, forgetting how often you swallowed disappointment, forgetting how much of yourself you edited to maintain that closeness. The mind rarely remembers imbalance accurately. It remembers familiarity. And familiarity feels like safety, even when it was draining. This is why healing is not just about letting go of others. It is about tolerating the discomfort of becoming unfamiliar to yourself. You are not only redefining relationships, you are redefining identity. If you were always the strong one, who are you when you allow vulnerability without overcompensating? If you were always the fixer, who are you when you let someone struggle without intervening? If you were always the one who stayed, who are you when you allow distance? These questions can destabilize your sense of self, because roles create stability. Even dysfunctional roles create stability, and growth dismantles them. You may notice guilt surfacing, a subtle feeling that you are abandoning people, that you are becoming selfish, that you are too much or too rigid now. But often what feels like selfishness is simply the absence of self-neglect. Often what feels like rigidity is the presence of self-respect. Often what feels like distance is the collapse of enmeshment. The mind, especially if shaped by early attachment patterns, interprets differentiation as danger, as loss, as rejection. But differentiation is not rejection. It is clarity. It is the moment you recognize where you end and someone else begins. And that line, that psychological boundary, may feel harsh at first because you were not used to having one. But without that line, connection is fusion. And fusion always requires someone to disappear. Healing refuses disappearance. Healing says, I can love you without dissolving. I can care without carrying. I can stay without shrinking. And that recalibration takes time. It takes repetition. It takes tolerating misinterpretation. It takes surviving the moments when someone labels you differently because you no longer behave predictably. But each time you do not collapse back into the old role, your identity stabilizes. Each time you resist the urge to repair what is not broken, your nervous system learns a new definition of safety. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the loneliness begins to feel less sharp. Not because everyone returned, but because you returned to yourself. What begins to emerge after this destabilizing phase is not immediate abundance, not a sudden wave of perfect relationships, but something far more significant. A quieter, more solid sense of internal authority. Because once you stop negotiating yourself for proximity, once you experience what it feels like to hold a boundary and survive the discomfort that follows, something fundamental shifts in your perception of connection. You realize that many of your previous bonds were maintained by effort, by anticipation, by subtle emotional management. And when that effort is removed, what remains becomes visible. Some relationships thin out naturally, not because they were malicious, but because they were structured around a version of you that no longer exists. Some people attempt to re-engage the old dynamic, pulling gently at your former role, testing whether you will step back into the familiar pattern. And this is where your growth stabilizes, not in dramatic declarations, but in repetition. You repeat your clarity. You repeat your pace. You repeat your boundaries without hostility and without apology. And over time, something remarkable happens. The intensity of the loneliness decreases, not because everyone returns, but because your nervous system adapts to this new form of connection, one that is not built on overfunctioning. You begin to notice a different kind of interaction entering your life. Conversations that do not require you to over-explain. People who do not interpret your silence as rejection. Moments of mutual presence where neither person is compensating for the other. These connections may be fewer, they may be quieter, but they feel regulated. They feel reciprocal. They do not exhaust you. And when you experience that kind of resonance, even briefly, you understand why the old dynamics had to dissolve. Because growth is selective. It does not expand every connection. It refines them. It filters them. It reveals which bonds were sustained by unconscious adaptation and which can withstand conscious differentiation. The paradox is this. Healing may shrink your circle before it deepens it. It may reduce noise before it increases meaning. It may create space before it creates alignment. And that space is not punishment. It is preparation. Preparation for relationships where you are not the emotional anchor for everyone else. Preparation for intimacy that does not depend on your silence. Preparation for belonging that does not require self-erasure. If you are in this phase right now, if you feel the thinning, the quiet, the subtle distance forming around you, understand that this is not evidence that you are difficult or detached. It is evidence that you are no longer unconsciously available for dynamics that require your diminishment. You are not becoming harder to love. You are becoming harder to consume. And there is a profound difference between the two. The people who can meet you at this level will not need the version of you that survived through accommodation. They will relate to the version of you that stands in clarity. And that clarity, even when it costs you familiarity, is the foundation of real stability. Healing does not isolate you permanently. It isolates you temporarily from what cannot evolve with you. And what remains, and what arrives next, will not require you to disappear in order to belong. If this resonates with you, if you are walking through this quiet recalibration where growth feels like distance, then this channel is for you. Here we explore the psychological layers beneath transformation, not the surface motivation, but the restructuring that changes how you relate, how you attach, and how you choose yourself. Subscribe if you are ready to grow consciously. And stay, because the next step in this journey is learning how to build connection without self-abandonment.